my sister wives that I'm leaving.
The Brown family had always been a seeming symbol of strength, unity, and unbreakable commitment on the surface. The world saw one big, functioning plural family that was regularly breaking through chaotic times with their laughter and love. But inside the walls of their homes, first in Utah, then Las Vegas, and finally Flagstaff, something much deeper had been brewing for years before anyone noticed the cracks. The collapse that ultimately tore the family apart was not sudden, but the steady unraveling of relationships, stacking up unspoken grievances, and weighted decisions by the one man who thought he still held control. This is the untold story of how it all started. When the Browns first announced they were moving to Flagstaff, fans were shocked but intrigued. A family built around shared spaces, shared responsibilities, and shared dreams, suddenly splitting up across different houses in a new city didn't make sense. To Cody, however, it seemed like a strategic step. He sold it as a fresh beginning, a time for the family to reconnect, rebuild, and prepare for what he called the next chapter. But the truth was far more complicated. Cody hadn't truly prepared the family for the emotional and financial storm that was coming. Christine was the first to notice that something was off. She remembered sitting in the kitchen of their Las Vegas home as Cody talked about Flagstaff like it was the promised land. He used words like opportunity, growth, and vision, but he danced around the hard questions. How would the kids adjust? How would the wives manage separate homes again? How would they afford everything? And most importantly, why the sudden urgency? Christine's instincts whispered that something wasn't being said, something Cody wasn't ready to share, something that explained the real reason he wanted the move. Meanwhile, Mary felt like she was disappearing further into the shadows. She had fought for her place in the family for years, but didn't break her spirit with the emotional distance. And yet, with the move fast approaching, she felt herself dwindling in relevance. The conversations happened around her, not with her. The decisions were made for her, not with her. Every time she tried to ask for clarity, she felt dismissed. Cody would say vague things like, "Trust the process," or "Everything will make sense," but the lack of explanation gnawed at her. Robin, on the other hand, was the consistent wife who stuck by Cody's side throughout the transition. He was consulting with her the most, and her opinions seemed to matter more and more. Of course, she didn't always agree with Cody's ideas, but she did trust him to have some sort of plan in store. Even she, however, witnessed him pacing around his house more than usual, making phone calls late into the night, and staring at papers he quickly tucked away whenever someone else entered the room. Whenever Robin would ask what was wrong, he'd give a soft smile and say, "Just big steps for the future." She believed him, but she also knew that Cody rarely worried like this unless something significant was going on behind the scenes. Janelle, logical, level-headed, and practical, was perhaps the most conflicted. She didn't love the idea of the move, but she also couldn't deny the financial potential if things worked out. She tried to approach the decision analytically, making spreadsheets, budgets, and projections, but the numbers didn't match Cody's optimism. Something wasn't lining up. And every time she asked to see the full financial documents, Cody would say he was still organizing things. After decades of knowing him, she recognized that phrase for what it truly meant. He wasn't ready to tell the whole truth. But in spite of the confusion, in spite of tension and doubts, the family moved. One by one, they packed their belongings, said goodbye to the lives they had built in Las Vegas, and began the arduous transition to Flagstaff. It didn't take long, though, for the problems to reveal themselves. In a matter of days, problems with the kids' schools, housing delays, and unexpected expenses piled up faster than anyone could manage. The wives felt the emotional distance get even greater. Rather than bringing the family together, Flagstaff created separate worlds. Each wife in her own home, each trying to support her children, each trying to maintain a connection with a husband who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The conversations that had been happening around large tables or in shared living rooms turned into quick check-ins and awkward scheduling attempts. The unity was ebbing, overshadowed by uncertainty, and Christine began to notice something she could not ignore. Cody was avoiding certain questions completely. Not with excuses, not with anger, but with silence. For Christine, that silence was more alarming than anything he could have said. That feeling turned to concern as she accidentally overheard part of a conversation Cody was having in the garage. She hadn't been trying to eavesdrop, but his tone caught her attention. He sounded frustrated, repeating words like risk, timing, exposure, and liability. These weren't words related to family or school or homes. These were business words, financial words, words tied to decisions that could impact everyone. As soon as Cody saw her standing in the doorway, he abruptly ended the call. He didn't look angry, he looked caught. Everything changed from that moment onward. Christine asked softly, "Who were you talking to?" But Cody just brushed it off, like it was nothing serious. Yet she had known him well enough to realize the stiffness in his shoulders, the evasive gaze, the intake of a deep breath before he spoke again. Cody did that only when he was concealing something. Meanwhile, the tension between the wives was getting stronger. Robin struggled with walking the tightrope of standing by Cody but being sensitive to the other wives. Mary felt more alone now than ever before. Janelle tried to remain reasonable, but even she couldn't deny that something was unraveling. The true collapse of the Brown family didn't happen on television. It didn't happen during one big fight or one dramatic event. It happened in the quiet moments, the unspoken fears, the unexplained decisions, the subtle shifts in loyalty, and the emotional exhaustion that grew heavier each day. What no one knew then was that one secret Cody had kept buried, one he knew was his problem and his alone to solve, would become the fuse. Eventually, Christine would discover the truth. Consequences would be taught to the wives, and the family would never be the same again. The first real fracture came quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way a hairline fracture appears in glass before the whole thing finally shatters. The kids felt it first. In Las Vegas, they had routines and friends and schools they loved, activities that helped them feel anchored. In Flagstaff, they found themselves bewildered by strange surroundings and lacking any explanation for what was happening to them. A few clung to optimism, trusting their parents would keep them safe. Others felt the growing resentment of having their lives yanked up without warning. Christine watched her kids struggle and felt her own frustration grow. She had always been the nurturer, the mother who kept the emotional pulse of the family steady. But in Flagstaff, she found herself putting out fire after fire, calming fears and comforting tears, trying to make home out of something that didn't feel like a home. The more she watched, the more she felt this wasn't about adjustment at all. The kids weren't unsettled, they were picking up on tension between their parents. Janelle noticed it too. She had always been practical, the one who believed that if you kept moving forward, things would eventually fall into place. But even she couldn't deny the heavy atmosphere around the family. Cody seemed distracted, unavailable. He was present physically, but emotionally distant, as though his mind was somewhere else entirely. He would show up at her house in a rush, act jittery, look at his phone constantly, and then rush out before she could even finish a conversation. She remembered one evening in particular. They sat in her living room, the kids upstairs, the house unusually quiet. She tried to ask him about the land on Coyote Pass, about the finances, about the plans he kept insisting were solid. Instead of answering, he gave vague reassurances and changed the subject. When she gently pressed, he sighed heavily, rubbed his forehead, and muttered, "There's a lot going on. I'm dealing with things you don't understand yet." It wasn't the words that bothered her, it was the word yet. It suggested he knew something the rest of them didn't, and that something was big enough to be kept hidden. Mary was stuck in her own emotional storm, however. Years had passed since the catfishing scandal, years she had dedicated to trying to fix things with Cody, working on herself, rebuilding trust, and trying to prove that she still fit into the family. But Flagstaff amplified everything that remained unsorted between them. Cody seemed colder, further away, and less apt to enter into even normal conversations. When she inquired as to what she could do to better the situation, he spoke of emotionally detached concepts like, "I'm not sure this relationship can be fixed," or "I don't have the energy to put into this anymore." Those words pierced deeper for Mary than any argument. She wasn't angry, she was heartbroken. She felt like she was watching a door slowly closing, and no matter how much she begged for an explanation, Cody wouldn't give one. Robin was caught in a different kind of turmoil. She deeply loved Cody, and she knew how much he trusted her above anyone else. But she knew something was wrong. She had seen him restless before, frustrated before, but never this overwhelmed. He juggled calls, meetings, documents, and late-night conversations that he refused to explain. When she pressed him on what was going on, he assured her it was family business, but the tone in his voice hinted at something far more complicated. She tried to reassure the other wives, tried to keep the peace, but even she couldn't hide her concerns. She felt like she was carrying the weight of the entire family's emotions while trying not to allow Cody to spiral further. Meanwhile, the financial pressure from the move had become impossible to overlook. The expense of multiple homes, the land payments, the problems with the mortgage, Flagstaff's unpredictable weather damaging the property, the sudden expenses arising from legal consultations, all were adding up faster than anyone had foreseen. Janelle watched the numbers mount and realized they were reaching a breaking point. One evening, after weeks of tension, she turned to Cody point blank and asked, "Are we in financial danger?" But instead of answering, he snapped defensively, "Why don't you trust me?" It was the first time in years that he'd raised his voice at her. She didn't argue back, but the look in his eyes told him that she already knew the truth. But Cody wasn't dealing with financial stress alone. He was fighting something that he never anticipated having to confront, a secret that had arrived long before the move, one he thought he could handle. But Flagstaff changed everything. The secrecy was harder to keep. The pressure grew weightier. Too much was at risk. Christine finally found the first clue when she happened upon a stack of papers in the backseat of Cody's car. She wasn't snooping. She had gone to get a jacket she'd left behind. But when she saw her name, Janelle's name, and Mary's name on several documents, documents she had never heard about, her heart dropped. She read the first line before she even realized what she was holding. Liability Distribution Proposal. The words turned her stomach. She scanned further. Risk exposure, individual responsibility, legal implication, potential dissolution framework. Legal implication? Dissolution? Individual responsibility? None of this sounded like the language of family unity or future planning in the way Cody had described it. These were legal terms, terms about separation, terms about division, terms about preparing for collapse, long before the family even admitted there was a problem. When she confronted Cody later that evening, he denied everything. He said she misunderstood, said the papers were old drafts, said he was just preparing for worst-case scenarios. But the cracks in his voice told her otherwise. For the first time, Christine looked at Cody not as her husband, not as the patriarch, but as a man who was hiding something so big that he couldn't even form a proper lie. For her, everything was different after that moment. She started paying closer attention. She watched the way he shifted when someone asked about the future. She noticed how often he left without giving details. She caught the flicker of panic in his eyes when financial topics came up. Janelle noticed the same thing, but from a different angle. She watched as he avoided eye contact every time the subject was budgeting. She saw his shoulders sag with exhaustion, his jaw tense. She recognized the signs of carrying a burden too heavy to share, because sharing it would expose everything. Meanwhile, Mary noticed something entirely different. She saw Cody emotionally withdraw not just from her, but from the whole family. And when the patriarch withdraws, so does the family. She watched the family dynamic crumble piece by piece, like a structure collapsing from the inside, invisible cracks widening with every passing week. Robin saw another side of it. Cody desperately trying to keep control, trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. She saw him fight invisible battles and lose sleep over things he never mentioned out loud. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the kind that only appears one knows the consequences of their decisions are about to hit everyone they love. The wives didn't know it yet. The kids didn't know it yet. The world watching them on TV certainly didn't know it yet. But the collapse of the Brown family wasn't just emotional, it wasn't just relational. It was structural, it was financial, it was legal, it was methodical. And Cody's biggest secret, the secret that forced the move, strained the relationships, and set the downfall into motion, was slowly making its way into the light. Christine realized something undeniable. This wasn't a family falling apart because of one man's decisions. This was a collapse engineered by years of hidden actions and quiet fears that Cody had hoped would stay buried forever. But secrets never stay buried in Flagstaff. The breaking point of the Brown family didn't explode in one dramatic moment, like in some reality TV finale, but rather unfolded like a slow leak. Small drops of resentment, unspoken arguments, and years of pain that had been brushed aside for the sake of family unity. But by the time cameras rolled into their Arizona home, those drops had already pooled into a flood no one could stop. To the outsider's eye, it was Christine's departure that seemed to mark the beginning of the collapse. Viewers saw that as the moment the house of cards finally fell. But behind the scenes, the cracks had been there for years, hidden under big smiles, perfectly timed confessional interviews, and the polished idea of what the Brown family was supposed to represent. In reality, it is a tale of collapse that starts with something rather simple, a family that stopped communicating in the same language. In earlier years, the Browns operated on a shared understanding that their lives were fraught with complication, but their familial bond was strong enough to support it. To them, at that time, polygamy meant teamwork and cooperation. It meant spiritual unity. Something different was happening now, though. The wives weren't adjusting in quite the same manner. The children were scattered and unsettled, and Cody himself was changing, more guarded, more defensive, more fixated on control than connection. Christine, who once prided herself on being the cheerful glue holding the family together, found herself slipping into loneliness. It wasn't one moment that broke her, it was 1,000 little moments. Holidays spent feeling like an afterthought, arguments where her feelings were dismissed, family meetings where she felt invisible, and nights when she realized she was sleeping alone far more often than with her husband. Her children noticed first. "Mom isn't smiling as much anymore," one whispered. "Mom cries a lot," another admitted. And in those quiet admissions came a realization everyone had feared. Something was deeply wrong. Meanwhile, Mary's silence grew heavier. She had lived for years under the shadow of the catfishing scandal, carrying guilt for a mistake she had already paid for 10 times over. And even after she forgave herself, her family never fully forgave her, not truly. The trust was gone, Cody's heart was gone, and though she desperately tried to rebuild the bridge between them, it was like building over shattered glass. Janelle was caught between two worlds, her loyalty to her family and her loyalty to her own peace. She had always been logical, steady, the one who could compartmentalize her emotions and keep moving forward. But even she found herself overwhelmed by the growing divide. She was tired of mediating, tired of pretending things were fine, tired of being told her perspective was wrong simply because it didn't align with Cody's shifting priorities. Then there was Robin, the wife many viewers believed was the catalyst of the collapse. But inside the family, a different truth existed. Robin did not set out to create division. She did not wake up and decide to become the center of conflict. But her relationship with Cody was different from the others, more affectionate, more communicative, more aligned. And even though she didn't mean to, her closeness to him created an imbalance that the family could never recover from. The wives saw it, the children did too, and slowly the family painfully began to splinter. By the time the pandemic hit, the Brown family was already stretched thin. The lockdown only magnified what was already there. Cody became strict, more protective, more controlling about rules he believed were necessary in order to keep the family safe. But each wife interpreted those rules differently. To some, they felt reasonable. To others, they felt suffocating and unfair. Because the wives weren't living under one roof, every household developed its own rhythm, one that didn't always align with Cody's expectations. Arguments became more frequent, misunderstandings grew deeper, and the wives began forming emotional alliances among themselves, sometimes unintentionally leaving others feeling excluded. Christine and Janelle bonded through shared frustration. Robin and Mary clung to each other for emotional support. And Cody, trying to juggle the expectations of 4 households, found himself overwhelmed and increasingly resentful. He said things he shouldn't have, words that couldn't be taken back, words that cut deeper than he realized. You're not loyal. You don't respect me. You're failing our family. Each sentence left a mark. Each moment was chipping away at the base. It finally reached a breaking point on a cold evening months before Christine officially announced she was leaving. She sat opposite Cody, her hands shaking slightly. All day she had been practicing in her head what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it, just the right mix of honesty and sensitivity. But when she opened her mouth to speak, the words came raw and unfiltered. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. Cody's features hardened, as if he had expected this but still hoped she wouldn't say it out loud. "Do what?" he asked. "Be in a marriage where I am alone," she said. "A marriage where I am last in everything. A marriage where my feelings don't matter." Cody let his breath out sharply, leaning back. "You're rewriting history," he said. "You know our relationship has always been hard. You know we've had problems. You can't blame all of this on me." "I'm not blaming you," she replied softly. "I'm just telling you the truth. I am not happy, and I haven't been for a long time." The pause thereafter was not a peaceful one. It was claustrophobic. From that night on, Christine knew that something inside her had forever shifted. She'd made up her mind, even if the family hadn't realized it yet. She didn't want to fight anymore. She didn't want to negotiate her worth. She didn't want to be part of a marriage where her voice felt like an inconvenience. The moment she packed Cody's things and placed them neatly in boxes was the moment she became free, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. Yet, for the rest of the Brown family, it was the moment the collapse could no longer be hidden. Cody was furious, hurt, blindsided. The other wives were shocked, though not surprised. And the children, especially Christine's, were devastated but supportive. They had seen their mother suffer for far too long. The word went out quickly through the family. Phone calls were made, tears came, and while some tried to hold the family together, others silently accepted that the era of the Browns as a united plural family was over. But the collapse didn't end with Christine leaving. Her leaving became the spark that would set many years of accumulated tension ablaze. It compelled everyone to confront the truth they had been avoiding. They had been living separate emotional lives long before they lived in separate homes. Mary's heartbreak became more visible. Janelle's tolerance grew thin. Robin's fear of losing the family heightened, and Cody, who was once confident as a patriarch, felt his authority crumble. He blamed the wives, he blamed the pandemic, he blamed the distance, but deep down, he knew he had a role in all that too. For years, his leadership had been the family's mainstay. Now they questioned everything, his decisions, priorities, and commitment to each other. And as every truth came to light, every hidden wound, every old argument resurfaced, the inevitable collapse of the Brown family occurred. Part 3 ends with the family no longer pretending, no longer holding back, and no longer standing on the same foundation. The emotional unraveling had begun, and what came next would change their lives forever. The aftermath of Christine's leaving was akin to shock that permeated every nook and cranny of the Brown family. What had once been a well-orchestrated balancing act of roles, duties, and expectations now felt chaotic, fragile, and completely unstable. It was as though the very structure of their family, the one they had built over decades, was suddenly exposed as paper thin. For Cody, the collapse was more than emotional. It was a strategic nightmare. He had prided himself on being the orchestrator, the patriarch who could maintain harmony among 4 wives and 18 children. But with Christine gone, the fragile system he had so relied on faltered. Responsibilities shared, often silently and without acknowledgement, felt like impossible burdens. Decisions once collective were now scrutinized, questioned, openly challenged. The first visible signs of strain appeared in daily routines. Breakfast tables, once noisy but predictable, turned into battlegrounds of subtle conflicts. The children were confused and anxious, acting out. Younger ones mimicked tension, older ones withdrew, and the lines of loyalty became increasingly blurred. Cody, who had always considered himself the moral compass and emotional anchor, found himself pulled in too many directions, unable to satisfy anyone fully. His frustration mounted, but so did the sense of isolation. Meanwhile, the wives were having their private struggles. Mary, already marginalized and hurt by the years of miscommunication and scandal, saw yet another shift in the emotional landscape. Without Christine as that buffer and mediator, she felt increasingly invisible. Every conversation became a test of patience, every interaction a subtle reminder that she was no longer at the center of Cody's world. The silent resentment she harbored started to manifest in subtle ways: withdrawn responses, passive-aggressive comments, and moments of deep sadness that went unnoticed by most but were still so deeply felt by those who knew her the best. Janelle had always been the steady one, the voice of reason, but her patience was stretched now to its limits. She tried to mediate conflicts, to hold the family together through reasoned dialogue and careful planning, but the cracks were too wide and the emotional stakes too high. Her own heartache, long buried under the weight of responsibility, resurfaced in late-night confessions, whispered fears, and private moments of doubt. She wondered whether the family could survive this collapse without losing more than just unity, whether they could preserve their individual dignity and emotional health in a structure that no longer functioned as intended. As Robin was often viewed as the favorite from outsiders' perceptions, yet she had her own emotional struggles. The closeness with Cody, which once comforted and partnered her, became her main controversy. She could sense the jealousy, the anger, the deep-seated pain of the other wives, and even though she did not cause these feelings, she could not help but fall prey to the consequences. Every gesture, every word she shared with Cody was under scrutiny and misinterpreted, creating tension that she had never expected. In some ways, Robin found herself trapped, caught between loyalty to her husband and loyalty to the family that she had joined but couldn't fully mend. As days turned into weeks, the children found themselves to be victims and silent witnesses of the unraveling. The children had grown up with a sense of order, an implicit understanding of where they fit in, who would protect them, and how decisions were made. But the move to Flagstaff, compounded by Christine's departure, threw that balance into disarray. The adolescents questioned authority, while the younger children struggled to adjust. Sibling dynamics changed as siblings tested loyalties. It was patently obvious that the collapse wasn't solely emotional, but reached right into the structural heart of the family at every level. The media added just another layer of pressure to the situation. Every moment, every reaction, every tear or smile was dissected online and broadcast to millions of viewers. Rumors spread faster than conversations could happen in the family's living rooms. Social media became both judge and jury, amplifying every disagreement, every perceived slight, every misstep. Cody's decisions, once private and strategic, were now public and widely judged. The wives felt their personal pain magnified by an audience that cared more for scandal than for understanding the emotional complexities involved. Financial strain then could no longer be ignored. Though the family had experienced some public recognition and a level of comfort from years on television, the costs of maintaining numerous houses, court battles, and personal security started piling up. Christine's exit brought not just emotional voids, but also logistical and financial gaps that needed attention. Every decision to do with money was knotted with emotional judgment, making the already strained relations all the more complicated. Through all of this, the Brown family was confronted with a myriad of uncomfortable truths. They had spent years protecting the image of unity, the perception of harmony, and the scripted version of plural marriage. But the reality was far messier. Individual needs had been sacrificed, personal boundaries ignored, communication compromised to maintain the veneer. And now, with the collapse well underway, those truths suppressed could no longer be contained. Decades of patriarchal guidance had suddenly been destabilized. Cody himself, who had once dictated the rhythm and direction, found himself facing unprecedented challenges. He struggled to maintain control, but control was no longer enough. Rebuilding trust required emotional intelligence, empathy, and transparency, all qualities that had been sacrificed to maintain the semblance of order. The wives, in pain themselves, started to make emotional spaces for themselves, seeking independence in thought and action. This new autonomy took the dynamic of the family further away. What used to be a tight-knit unit transformed into a web of different lives that crossed each other at the most important junctures. The cohesion this family had enjoyed for years then gave way to fragmentation and cautious negotiation. Part of the collapse was also cultural, a clash between individual desires and the collective expectation of polygamy as a spiritual and family-centered lifestyle. While outsiders saw only fame, money, and drama, the internal reality was far more profound: an identity struggle, a struggle for agency, and for emotional survival. Each wife had her unique challenge: to redefine her role, assert her boundaries, and protect her children from the fallout. The tension reached critical when, instead of solving problems, family meetings became arenas for blame. Words were said that could not be taken back, accusations cut deeper than anyone had wanted, and long-simmering resentments exploded in ways that permanently reshaped relationships. The collapse was no longer subtle. It was palpable, visible, undeniable. And even while the family did its best to put on a united front for the cameras, the fractures were clear to anyone paying attention. And yet, amidst the chaos were moments of clarity and unexpected resilience. The family learned that in breakdown, folks could muster strength, rediscover purpose, and seek healing. Christine's exit, while painful, commanded conversations years overdue. Mary's introspection provided her an opportunity to begin unraveling the pain of her past. Janelle's voice, once muted, found new avenues for expression. Robin learned that compassion and understanding are crucial, even when perceived dominance stands in place. Cody had the opportunity, though challenging, to reflect upon leadership and accountability in a deeply human, personal way. The collapse was no longer in the future, but was now a reality, and its immediate and long-term repercussions would determine the course the family took for years. Tension in the Brown household had almost reached an unbearable peak. Months of emotional upheaval, shifting alliances, and fractured trust had created an environment that was at once unstable and constricting. Every interaction now carried the weight of past grievances, and every decision seemed to trigger ripple effects no one could fully anticipate. Even while the family tried to put on a face of normalcy for the cameras, these cracks just could not be hidden. Cody was in the eye of this emotional hurricane. He could no longer command the same level of respect for his patriarchal authority, one that he had depended on for decades. Christine's absence created a void that no other wife was fully capable of replacing. While Cody tried to tighten the reins, his actions became counterproductive, contributing to increased stress instead of resolving the issue. Private talks that earlier would lead to cooperation concluded with silence, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive conflict. For the first time, Cody was forced to deal with the actual consequences of his choices, those that seemed calculated and workable at the time, but had spiraled so far out of control. Mary's presence in the home was both a reminder of past conflicts and a reflection of ongoing pain. She carried with her a quiet resentment, a deep sense of betrayal, and an anger that could no longer be contained. Though she had often been the invisible wife, the collapse forced her voice to be heard. Her emotional evolution was a slow burn, her every action now the result of deliberation, strategy, and calculation. Every choice she made now carried weight, not only for herself, but for the larger family dynamic. But now, Janelle, the long-acknowledged peacemaker in the family, faced her biggest challenge. She sought to keep everyone calm, but the emotional stakes were too high. Frustration and feelings of helplessness beset her as her efforts to mediate often ended badly. Her growing awareness of Cody's inability to maintain equilibrium made her question not only his leadership, but also the ability of their family's structure to survive. In private, she wrestled with profound doubts over the future and her place in the family, wondering if all the sacrifices and loyalty she'd invested in the family were for nothing. Robin, who had often been perceived as the favored wife, now felt the weight of scrutiny more than ever. Her relationship with Cody, once seemingly unassailable, was now under constant observation. Every gesture, word, and decision she made was analyzed not just by her co-wives, but a global audience. She knew her role in the collapse was complicated, in that while she did not actively seek out conflict, she aligned with Cody, making her a focal point of resentment and blame. The psychological toll was immense, and she began to question whether a position of perceived advantage was worth the cost to her mental and emotional well-being. The children, meanwhile, were trying to find their way through a new and unfamiliar landscape. Teenagers grappled with loyalty, identity, and trust. Younger children felt tension for which they had no words. School, friendships, and extracurricular activities now became the conduit for feelings that could not be expressed at home. Sibling relationships changed radically as alliances formed and broke, and once secure bonds were stretched in ways that left lasting impressions. The children's responses, often low-key yet profoundly significant, further entangled the web of family dynamics, adding layers of unpredictability to a volatile environment. These internal pressures were further complicated by external forces. Property, will, and financial battles threatened to engulf the family members in court. Every disagreement was magnified by court decisions, public views, and media attention, making private matters public spectacle. Whatever problems the Brown family had were no longer confined within the four walls of the house. They were publicly broadcast, analyzed, and scrutinized for the world to view. This kind of visibility increased tension, made reconciliation even more hard to achieve, and put every member under enormous pressure to perform or put up appearances. In the process, conversations that had long been avoided finally made their way to the surface. Secrets, grievances, and frustrations surfaced in raw, unfiltered ways. Christine's decision to leave, once a private matter, set into motion a chain of reflection that brought forth truths suppressed for decades. Cody faced an uncomfortable reality. His attempt to control the narrative had failed. He came to understand, perhaps too little too late, that authority without empathy and control without accountability could do little else but collapse. The family had reached a tipping point. Moment reconciliation or total transformation was all possible. But amidst the chaos, there were moments of hope. Family members began setting boundaries and claiming autonomy, attempting emotional healing. Small actions of communication, honesty, and understanding cut through tension like rays of light in a storm. Those moments, however brief, showed that where collapse was real, growth, change, and rebuilding were possible. Still, the road ahead was not at all certain, and every choice brought consequences that could redefine their family forever. And then, just when it seemed that the family might settle down, a fresh development sent everything off kilter. Reports surfaced of a court filing, a shocking turn of events, in which property would be redistributed, inheritances realigned, and power would shift in ways none had fathomed. Emotions ran deep as rumors swirled and private fears became public speculation. The Brown family stood at a precipice, with decisions looming that would have either the potential to heal or permanently fracture the fragile bonds remaining. The stakes were higher than ever, and the question asked was whether the Brown family could survive through this challenge, or whether the forces that had been building up both internally and externally over the years would finally bring it all crashing down. Only time would tell, and the world watched as the next chapter of the Brown family saga unraveled itself.